Hello, and welcome to Varn Vlog. And today we're doing uh, one of the rare things where I start a new series that touches on multiple areas of my interest and life and even aesthetic taste that I don't talk about much. I'm talking about one of my favorite authors, William T. Vollmann. Now, I have a lot of favorites, but with prose authors, both fiction and nonfiction, that are not philosophical explicitly. I'm not including the philosophers and the critical theorists and the economists here. Okay, we're just dealing with people who write literary prose. My favorite writers in prose are Clarice Lispector, Gene Wolfe, Samuel Beckett, Doug Peacock, Greg Childs, Kelly Wells, Helen MacDonald. But I love William T. Vollmann. Vollmann is an interesting figure, and I'm going to be spending a lot of time talking about the 7-volume version of Rising Up and Rising Down. You can find the abridged version by Echo Books that was published a few years later, but the full version of Rising Up and Rising Down is very hard to come by. It came out when I finished my undergrad. I really wanted to buy it, but I didn't have the $150, $200 to throw down on it. And now if you can find a paper copy, it's several $1,000s minimum to get a version. It came out in 2003, the book that we're discussing, and I'll talk about this, and it and Carbon Ideologies, which came out, I believe, around 2018, which is two books, No Intimate Danger and No Good Alternative, is some of the most interesting and devastating writing I've ever dealt with. It's interesting. It's interested in systems. It's interested in anecdotes. It's interested in revolution. It comes from both a journalistic and literary perspective, from someone who's seen real violence up close. Vollmann, to me, was always a pock-faced but more interesting counterpart to David Foster Wallace. And while I'm not as interested in the David Foster Wallace hate that was all the rage when people turned on him a few years after his death, Vollmann has not suffered either that popularity or that backlash. He's mainly known for one massive book, Europe Central, which won the National Book Award for Fiction in 2005. Vollmann is a quintessential Gen Xer, born in 1959, maybe even a young boomer. A BA for Cornell, went to Berkeley for a while. He got a fellowship for a doctoral program in comparative literature. Like me, he's a PhD dropout. I think he made it longer than me. He made it a full year. I didn't even make it to start classes. Even though now I'm practically ABD. It's a funny thing. Vollmann's work is prolix. I mean, he writes pages and pages and pages, and they're dense. All right. They're full of references and all kinds of history, interleaved with reporting. He was obsessed with the brutal history of the American landscape, and that came up in his 7 Dreams series, which he only finished 6 of. And actually, he only finished 5 of. He skipped volume 4, and volume 7 never came out. So The Ice Shirts was volume 1. Fathers and Crows was volume 2. These both came out in the early 90s. Argyle, which was a true story of Pocahontas and John Smith, came out in 2001 as volume 3. Dying Grass came out in 2015 as volume 5. The Rifles as volume 6 came out in 1994. So you can see they were not even written consecutively. This is the kind of writer we're dealing with. And like I said, volume 4 and volume 7 from this trilogy are never released. There's the Prostitution trilogy, which includes Whores for Gloria, Butterfly Stories, a novel, and The Royal Family, all of which are from the 90s. But most of what he spent a lot of time working on, in addition to a few short stories and a book called The Atlas, which is a collection of all kinds of writings, is nonfiction. He wrote a book on Afghanistan in the 80s and 1992. He wrote a book on Copernicus and the revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, part of the Great Discovery series, which also David Foster Wallace again wrote for. He wrote a book on poverty called Poor People in 2007. He wrote another book about traveling the American landscape called Riding Towards Everywhere in 2008. He wrote a book on No Feeder in 2010. A book on post-earthquake Japan, which was only done as an ebook in 2011, but was incorporated into Carbon Ideologies, which is another masterwork by him in 2018. Vollmann is an interesting figure. Obsessed with California, but very different than Joan Didion. Of a particular generation, as I mentioned, the comparison to David Foster Wallace comes up all the time, but he's not David Foster Wallace. He's a much more visceral writer. And I think he's underread. But most importantly, let's get into Rising Up and Rising Down, which I think this series on Vollmann is going to primarily focus on. And I don't know how many of these I'm going to do, but I think I'm going to do a lot because Rising Up and Rising Down was written between 1983 and 2003. Only 3,500 copies were published by McSweeney's. It is an attempt to come up with a moral calculus in a systemic way that is literarily interesting from case studies about the use, justifications, and consequences of violence. Now, I don't agree with all of Vollmann's politics in this, but in many ways, it is a devastating read. It is over 3,000 pages in its completeness, and like I said, it is 7 volumes, 6 volumes plus the moral calculus volume. You can get the abridged version, which is smaller, but it's still almost 1,000 pages. I'm going to be reading chunks of this book, and I'm going to read them pretty thoroughly and compare them to what we think or what I think. This isn't really a radical engagements because it's not a commentary on a short work or even that systemic. This is to get you interested in reading Vollmann and pondering the question Vollmann actually asks. If you can get a copy of the abridged version of Rising Up and Rising Down, I find them all the time in used bookstores. I've owned 3 or 4 versions of it. I own one now. I do not expect you to find the unabridged version. If you do find it, expect to pay several $1,000s for it. I would also tell you to read Carbon Ideologies, and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit too. But Vollmann is a massive influence on me that I don't talk about. His project on violence has inspired me for most of my writing life. And I've seen some things when I was abroad. Not even trying to. I wasn't a war correspondent. I just happened to be in a lot of unfortunate places at a lot of unfortunate times. And I've gone back to this book to try to understand what I saw and why. When path dependencies break, the nothing ever happens stops happening. What replaces it? Usually violence, coercion. Between equal rights, force decides. So maybe it's time to be thinking about what Vollmann thought about 22 years ago or 40 years ago. Vollmann's an old man now. He's 65. He's still writing, I think. He's had work come out relatively recently, but I think his last major work was Carbon Ideologies, and that now is 7 years old. He's written one essay in Harper's in 2023. So maybe we won't have a lot more of Vollmann. Maybe we'll never get those 2 volumes of the 7 Dreams that haven't come out yet. Who knows? We're going to start today in volume 1 of Rising Up and Rising Down. Some thoughts on violence, freedom, and urgent means. This is volume NC, which is the first volume, but the annotated contents, moral calculus, index of moral actors, annexes and sources cited. Don't worry, I'm not going to read all the boring stuff. Quote, these subjects will certainly have to be discussed to some extent, but if they were covered in any sort of detail, the book would be so long that only a dedicated student of insurgency would read it, and he would probably be an insurgent. Brigadier Frank Kitson, Low Intensity Operations. This essay is intended as a companion piece to my memoir, The Afghanistan Picture Show, and to my novel, You Bright and Risen Angels. In those books, most reference is made to do-it-yourself politics of an extreme character, aka the revolutionary character. Rising Up and Rising Down is a critique of terrorist, defensive, military, and police activity, combined with some more general thoughts on when violence may be appropriate. I offer it to you, my unknown reader, in hopes that it may someday save a life or comfort a seeking mind. WTV, San Francisco, New York, Sacramento, 1982 to 1998. Second, I did them. No doubt I have Osama bin Laden to thank for the fact that this work is getting published in my lifetime. People have advised me to bring it up to date by inserting references to the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. I feel no interest in doing that, although a footnote here and there pays note to those grisly events. Nor did I alter any case studies, some of which were set in Muslim countries. If you read them with that knowledge, you will see that even a superficial observer such as myself, some sort of attack was predictable and perhaps preventable. I assure you that it will get worse. What has been done, for fear that the book wasn't long enough, was to add a few more case studies, including one from Yemen, dateline on and after September 11th, 2002. It was commissioned by the New Yorker and then rejected for not being political enough. The text throughout has benefited from several new sources, and various arguments are further puffed up and ossified. It is said of Napoleon that, quote, he held our imagination in his hands, sometimes hands of steel, sometimes hands of velvet. One never knew how it was going to be from day to day. so that there was no means of escaping. This is how this book has gripped me. Year after year, I'm very relieved to be free from it. I hate it. At the same time, I'm proud of it, and I hope that it can benefit someone. WTV, Sacramento, 2003. 2001 to 2003 was a formative period in my life. I was still a conservative, but I've told that story 1,000 times. There's more stories, though, that I haven't told and probably never will. I will say that in that time period, I felt the grip of the apocalyptic fever of the 80s and 90s recede into a more secular haze. And I became obsessed with when systems break down. You may notice that's still true today. I discovered Joseph Tainter in this time period. I became a big fan of J.G. Ballard in this time period, another favorite that I forgot to mention. Now, you might know me as the socialist who spends a lot of time going through the exact nature of 19th century politics, and that's fine. That's the image I've chosen for myself because of what I've sought to clarify about systems and political change, social economic change, etc. You can't do that without dealing with Marxism, and that's been my primary focus. Not to validate or condemn Marxism, although I do consider myself a socialist and one strongly from a Marxist tradition, but I've never thought that every dot and iota in Marx was worth defending. It was just worth understanding and articulating correctly and not using as a cipher for whatever you wanted to put in a 19th century man's mouth. Maybe in talking about Vollmann, in this book in particular, you will start to see what my interest in systemic things really are and why this book was kind of a gateway drug to that. My obsession, even with virtue theory, in some ways, comes from this book. Like I said, this book is over 3,000 pages long. So I obviously can't cover all of it. But let's get back into this beginning. Moral calculus. And we start off with a bunch of quotes. The dull empiricism, the unashamed, cringing worship of the fact, which is often imaginary and falsely interpreted at that, were odious to me. Beyond the facts, I look for laws. Trotsky, My Life. But if ye will need to have the law, I always have my law. Martin Luther, Commentary on Galatians. Robespierre was not above using what Marat called a very simple calculus. Mona Azoff, Essay on Marat. Genius rises itself above all rules, but when we reach those ranks where we can look for no other notions but those which the regulation of the services and experience afford, we must help them with the methodic forms harboring on those regulations. This will serve both as a support to their judgment and a barrier against their extravagant and erroneous views, which are so especially to be dreaded in the sphere where experience is so costly. Clausewitz on war. The greater part of what my neighbor called good, I believe in my soul to be bad, and if I repent of anything, it is likely to be of good behavior. Thoreau, Walden. An excuse is as good as gold. A Serb on the train. To conjure up a conscience in others is tempting to anyone who wishes to extend his control beyond the legal limits. Garrett Hardin, You refuse to understand that since vices exist, it is as unjust for you to punish them as it would be to jeer at a one-eyed man. Marquis de Sade. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Jesus Christ, Sermon on the Mount. Being noble isn't important. Saving lives is important. Virginia, in quotation marks, Animal Liberation Front member. If I were at the place of execution and I saw the fire lighted and the faggots catching and the executioner ready to build up the fire, even so I would say nothing else, and I will maintain what I have said at this trial until death. I have nothing more to say. Joan of Arc. Let's get into the apology and disclaimer. And then I'll finish this session. The following principles of conduct were all extracted verbatim whenever possible from the first 4 theoretical volumes of the text. Ethics, not yet being a circumstantially exact science, should it ever become so, free will and cultural variability might be compromised. We shouldn't expect that this or any moral calculus will itself permit every rational user to arrive at the same judgment of a given case. Benjamin Franklin used to divide a sheet of paper into 2 columns, one in favor of a decision and the other against. Quote, and though the weight of reasons cannot be taken with the precisions of algebraic qualities, ellipses, I have found great advantage from the kind of equation it may be called moral or prudential algebra, unquote. Much of this procedure indeed makes common sense, but its sums, variables, and formulas, necessarily or unnecessarily, rest upon vaguely defined terms. Plato's moral calculus differs from Cartes's, not the least because their definitions of piety are different. Moses' 10 commandments leave linen cold, in part on the account of disagreement over the defined range and domain of that variable called man. Does it include or dominate woman? May it be substituted for God? Does its characteristics alter with its productive class? Should you find fault with the calculus, as you ought to, I do my best to find fault with everybody else's, and my chapter on the defense of animals remains especially unsatisfactory. I respectfully ask you to not leave a vacuum, that's important, but to construct your own, something I've been trying to do for most of my life. The translator of the 2 collections of Zen koans has noted that there is no correct answer to a koan, and indeed, one student's right answer may be wrong if uttered by another. I've experienced that firsthand. Which does not put the first defense of gender, which might repudiate female circumcision, or defense of culture, which might demand it. When does the defense of race, or one's own family, supersede the defense of homeland? My moral calculations cannot tell you that. However, what it can do is to remind you that if you consider only one of those 2 categories of defense, your judgment will remain superficial, unfair, and therefore unrealistic. Can the defense of gender meet the defense of culture somewhere? I hope and believe so, provided that both sides respect each other by applying some approximation of the golden rule. More generally, I believe that along with the continuation of answers to moral political koans, we hope to find a broad and sometimes generous, but not excessive width of reasonable consensus. Yet the divergence may at times widen far enough to allow for more than one specific right choice. For example, in the case of Caesar versus Pompey, for the people and the situation less frequently dazzle us with the pinpoint light of the self-evident truth that with the diffuse glare of ambiguity. Still in all, the question of when violence is justified need not be left entirely unanswered. On the subject of consensus, please note that this quality, on which I've tried to find my own definition of legitimate authority to carry out many acts of violence simply does not exist for the following categories: the ethos of a homeland, ethos, ethnicity, the identity of race, place, and animals, ecological threat, inalienable qualities of creed. More traditional categories such as class inevitably provoke irreconcilable differences of opinion, but it remains possible to argue that those differences are based on common presuppositions about fundamental human rights. Such presuppositions have scarcely begun to evolve for the categories mentioned here. I would be very proud if Rising Up and Rising Down encouraged someone to add might to the long process of establishing some broad or minimal agreement on such questions as: what right do we grant an ancient redwood grove to remain as it is? What alien ethos of creed, homeland, or race can we tolerate? And when do customs, which some people consider abhorrent, such as hunting, justify violent intervention? Does a white supremacist have the same rights as a black supremacist? I have done my own poor best to wrestle with these questions. If the results are half baked, please heap your own, mostly inflammatory prejudices onto the fire and help with the cooking. The best way to apply this calculus to a particular act is to examine the rules for every sort of justification which might possibly be applicable to it. What claim to righteousness might a Palestinian suicide bomber possess? Uh, an overstated trope, but one that he's at least taking seriously. To evaluate that claim, one might apply the calculus to him and his enemies regarding A, the justification concerning homeland, B, creed, C, war aims, and not neglecting the proportionality and discrimination, D, grounds, E, honor, and F, authority, and 2, the policies of deterrence, retaliation, and punishment, and 3, the fate evocation of inevitability. Then and only then can one begin to employ Franklin's moral algebra, or Bentham's, or J.S. Mills, or any of these thinkers, although Franklin was no utilitarian. He was a virtue ethicist, but one who was given to the math pretensions that the Anglo brain seems to be given to. Back to Vollmann. When one commits violence, it is more likely that it will be unjustified than justified. Therefore, I would advise that if an act seems by the rules of Section 6 to be classified as evil, it should be treated as suspect at best. On the other hand, if the act seems to obey all the rules for justifications listed in Section 5, you should be treated as somewhat less suspect. At its most noble, an act which passes all the tests of Section 5 can only be said to tend towards being justified. Since these rules necessarily remain vague and their interpretations open to opinion, no one test is sure. And 5.1.6 should be kept in mind. These are numbered. You have to deal with that in this text. It's a weird text. Calculuslessness reliably produces amoral brutality, but as Clausewitz reminds us, methodetic system easily becomes stupidity. We must seek out the truth of each particular case. Section 1.0. What is the best way to seek truth? 1. In solitude. A member of any organization can hardly, without visiting the darkly mysterious world of non-organization, comprehend the truth about his organization. That is, the truth of what he has done and caused. I have seen and applauded Julius Caesar's clemency to my fellow Romans, but I have taken counsel with myself to see whatever purpose and whose service he was so leniently fights is equally applaudable. 2. Also in diverse company. A hermit may come to know himself, but unless he listens to others and sees the happiness and suffering of others, he cannot know if what seems right for him will also be right for others. Moreover, a witness knows, even if he misunderstands what he knows, how a Spaniard fairly judge the Mexican conquest without first inquiring of the remnant Aztecs. 3. Throughout history, the world was different once. Learn what today's truth has in common with yesterday's. Hitler invokes the defense of homeland. So does Lycurgus the Spartan. My president, at this time Bush, invokes it today. George W. Bush. Which of those two predecessors, if either, does he more faithfully resemble? 4. And through service, he who helps not cares not. He who cares not possesses no right to guide others' lives. I should have that tattooed. 5. And through the commission of error and through patient revision, no organic law can ever be framed with the provisions specifically applicable to every question which may occur in practical administration. The moral calculus is the best I could do, and I hope that studying its successes and failures may help you do better than I have done. 6. And by eliminating the redundant terms and categories which make it difficult to distinguish a logically valid axiom from a universal one, or from a tautology, quote, a war of the Soviet Union against the imperialist aggressor would be a just war, really means a war against an aggressor would be a just war. In italics. Experience alone and theoretical guiding alone falter. Hence the two parts of this book. Context must inform the act we judge, but it cannot predetermine the judgment. 1.1 How to form a moral code. 1. Follow your own inner logic and feeling in order to postulate the laws of conduct which seem to you good. 2. Follow the laws if they correspond to local norms and reconsider them if they violate those norms. But 3. Above all, choose the right regardless of local authority or custom, and then act accordingly with due regard to the first law of violent action. Quote, the inertia of the situation into which we interject ourselves must always be given the benefit of a doubt. Look before you leap, which can be restated in italics. Assume any potential victim of your violence may be worthy of self-preservation as yourself, until that assumption has been disproven by the remainder of your moral calculus. And 4, follow the golden rule well possible, and it gives the most generous possible interpretation. In other words, follow the empath's golden rule, point 1 to point B. A. The golden rule has become more valid than ever in reference to no one's dependence. B. We bear an obligation is to study and intuit the identity of the other, his rights and needs, an appropriate mode of self-expression, his ethos. That is the only way to know how he wishes to be done by. 1.2 Variations of the Golden Rule. 1. The Golden Rule. Do as to others, do as to you would be done by. I almost said do as to others as others do unto you, because that's how I know it. But in the event that I wish others to do unto me something that which others would not wish for themselves, then the golden rule would not be justified. In fact, it would become the zealot's golden rule, mostly justified. Corollary. Personalizing a situation may help prevent violence. The golden rule warns and guards. However, personalizing an already violent situation could make it worse, because witnessing outrage committed on a golden rule inclines us to bitterness. Paul Bloom actually talks about this as a side effect of empathy that is under discussed, about the potential for empathy to breed disgust and violence in a violent situation. Paul Bloom is right about that. I don't always agree with Paul Bloom, but you should check out his book Against Empathy. It's a mixed book, but that part's really convincing. Example, and this is back to Vollmann. In the Yugoslavian Civil War, I may resist the temptation to cut throats if I realize it will be my neighbor's throat that I must cut. But once I've cut my neighbor's throat, my violence has to pass the limit. I've done the worst, then cut a stranger's throat. My neighbor's children may never forgive me. Or should they? Caveat: the golden rule is justified only when applied to acts which all parties affect agree will contribute to their own conception of goodness, or when dissenting party is a bona fide dependent of a moral actor. Otherwise, it easily becomes the zealot's golden rule. We'll get to that in a second. 2. The impasse golden rule. Do unto others not only as you would be done by, but also as they would be done by. In the case of any variance, do the more generous thing. Justified. 3. The zealot's golden rule. Do unto others as you are doing for yourself. Cortez exemplifies this fallacy. I am a Christian, so I'll force everyone else to be Christians. Do unto others can be justified only when applied to acts which all affected parties agree will contribute to goodness as they define it, or when the dissenting party is a dependent of a moral actor, unjustified. Compared to 0.132. Variant, the missionary's golden rule. Do unto others as you convince yourself they would be done by. Example, Cortez again. Quote, tell the truth. It is war and warriors that really persuade the Indians to give up their idols. Ellipses. And it is thus that their own free will and consent they more quickly, ellipses, accept the gospel. Variant B, the Marxist golden rule. This is Vollmann's skepticism of Marxism is much stronger than mine, but this is interesting. Do unto others as you convince yourself they would be done by, and do to the rest whatever your ends require. Unjustified. Example, the Bolsheviks give land to the people by forcibly enrolling them in collective farms while expelling and repressing rich peasants. The anti-Kulak policies. Not going to get into that today. I think the anti-Kulak policies were done in a ham-fisted way, but I don't think it's actually a simple case. 4. The sailor's golden rule. Do unto others as you are done by. He shoots at me, so I shoot at him. This reduces moral actions to moral reactors. Always justified in situations of imminent self-defense, unjustified as a general moral code. 5. The terrorist golden rule. Do as your end requires. This places the moral actor beyond anyone else's judgment. Unjustified. 6. The golden rule of Greek city-states. Let others do unto others whatever doesn't affect me. Justified or not, one should certainly be very cautious. 1.3. Maxims for murderers. The following propositions are the rough and ready character. A murderer needs no others. Other murderers can add to them, and ought to help them feel righteous afterwards. The rest of us consider them as beacons warnings us away from evil shoals. The Antichrist maxim. If you were once an enemy, then you will always be. By making reconciliations impossible, this perpetuates violence. John Brown's maxim. If you refuse to follow the golden rule, then I have a right to use terror to impel you to follow it. Very similar to the zealot's golden rule. 3. Caesar's maxim. Should I extend mercy beyond expediency, then I have a right to commit whatever aggression I please. 4. Cleon the Athenian's maxim. Quote, it is a general rule of human nature that people despise those who treat them well and look up to those who make no concessions. This too makes reconciliation impossible. It approaches the viciously literalist Marxist-Leninist interpretation of class struggle. And again, I don't know if Vollmann's being completely fair there, but we'll eventually get to his discussions of these things. 5. Cortez's maxim. In order to scare and defend my ground, I have every right to conquer yours. 6. The crocodile's maxim. If we lost the last war, it's a grievance. If we run the last war, it's the status quo. 7. Hitler's maxim. Your homeland ought to belong to me, so I have the right to defend it against you. 8. Field Marshal Keitel's maxim. For a soldier, orders are orders. 9. The Clansman's maxim. If I believe your race or culture threatens mine, I have a right first to threaten you back, then to remove your threat by violence. It is in its readiness to give sole discretion for judging the means and ends to the perpetrator of violence, if I believe I have the right. This maxim recalls Trotsky's, which is coming up. 10. Napoleon's maxim. Only once I reify collective honor into standards and monuments, you must bleed for them. The short form, all honor is honorable. This translates to the terrorist golden rule. 11. Shaka's maxim, quote, if a foe were worth conquering at all, he has sworn crushing out of existence once and for all. 12. Trotsky's maxim, no one who disagrees with me is allowed to judge me. Again, this is a variant of the terrorist golden rule. 13. The victim's maxim, if any number of your side burn any member of my side, then your side is completely in the wrong. A. The victim's corollary, any moderate on my side is an enemy. B. The second victim's corollary, if you are still not one of us, I need neither trust you nor recognize your service. 1.4. Maxim for tyrants. These may not necessarily be as lethal as the maxim for murderers, but they still promote violence, injustice, and death. I mean, I would love for you to define injustice, Vollmann, but maybe you will later on in the book. This is, after all, a several thousand-page book. And no, it's not all written in this mathematical form. This beginning part is, and I'm only doing part 1 for you to get a flavor of this, but let's finish it. Plato's maxim made politic. No one will ever prove a credible servant unless we can keep him a servant for all times. Number 2, the slave master's maxim. If I were born better than you, I have the right to rule you. Practically speaking, this is indistinguishable from Cleon the Athenian's maxim. 1.5, maxim for self-defenders. In my opinion, these can be trusted, provided each word is employed with honest literalness. 1, the shepherd's maxim. As authority enlarges itself, it is an obligation to protect from violence the individuals it controls increases, and the ability of the individual to defend themselves from violence comprehendedly decreases. Corollary. Because the right to self-defense remains inalienable, each of us can and should maintain a self-reliant distrust of authority. 2, the weapon owner's maximum. When authority cannot protect me, I must protect myself. So we have a system of maxims laid out. Now, I don't think Vollmann's always fair, but he is giving us a vision of various justifications of political and social violence throughout history. And he's trying to systemically lay these out as like paradigmatic case studies that we could use to figure out what our virtues around violence would be if we so found ourselves in the situation where we had to deal with violence. Is it successful? No. I mean, you have to agree with some of Vollmann's prepositions, even in these maxims. But it does give you a way to start putting yourself and building models of mind for the way people think about violence other than just the moral reactor phase, which, if you've heard me talk about emotivism and the critique of it from Lester McIntyre, and while I buy that critique, it's because emotivism will do whatever you need to do. It's almost inherently short term. You can't separate emotions from reasons, and people who think I want you to do that are foolish. Any systemic view, any calculus, any view of virtues that are codified in a systemic way still must include the affective nature of reality in it and the different perspectives of which we come and why we come from them. And Vollmann really has us start to break down what these models in our head may be and what they can be used to justify. And if we can start thinking about where these justifications might work and where they don't, and even if I would love for Vollmann to clarify some key terms here, instead of just assuming them like rights and justice are not words I tend to use. Rights are only political unless one believes in an inalienable social order and a natural law from which they emerge. And so every liberal's always fought me on the fact that I don't believe that human rights are always the best framework for talking about what makes humans flourish are the limitations, are conflicts between things that makes humans flourish. I also find Vollmann's skepticism of Marxism to be, problematic, but I don't think we should totally discount it as just a product of the Cold War. Although we must remember that from that period. Vollmann's not a particularly conservative person. I mean, if you read his writing, that becomes very clear. So, what do we do with that? Well, that's the question we have to ask for ourselves and answer for ourselves. I hope you get stuff out of the series. I plan to do a couple a month. I'll sneak them in my rotation. I don't think they're going to replace the Monday ones. If you like this, like and subscribe to hear more. And no, I'm not going through all the parts of the entirety of this book or even the entirety of this first section. I mean, this first section of calculus and means and all that, which is not even representative of the way the book is actually written in a lot of places, is still 280 pages. So that's one of Vollmann's faults, is he's not good at being short in a novel length material, but he is kind of both interesting and exhaustive, idiosyncratic, and he attempts to be in some ways systemic, even if his attempts to make it a calculus is probably misguided. We'll come back to Vollmann. And maybe you'll see why I love him so much, even if I disagree with him, and why he has informed a lot of my later interests in things like complexity theory, cybernetic theory, general systems dynamics, Marxism and historical materialism, analytic Marxism, which I'm increasingly critical of, but at least respect in some ways, game theory, virtue ethics, cultural virtues and anthropology. All that stuff can be found here. And think about what it may mean for you. Protect your peace. And maybe you'll get why I say that so much as you listen to me talk about Vollmann.